On a freezing night in April 1912, the largest ship ever built struck an iceberg in the dead of the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 souls slipped into the icy abyss. It was a tragedy that shocked the world, a disaster that redefined human hubris, and a story you think you know completely. But what if I told you that every single detail of this nightmare, the weight of the ship, the speed of the collision, the catastrophic shortage of lifeboats, and even the exact name of the vessel itself, had already been written down in a book, 14 years before the ship was even built? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not a modern internet myth. This is the chilling, documented reality of a struggling maritime writer named Morgan Robertson. In 1898, he published a short novel that nobody cared about. A novel that would later become the most terrifying prophecy in human history. To understand how deep this mystery goes, we have to look closely at the mind of the man who wrote it, the exact mathematical impossibilities of his predictions, and the other forgotten prophets who saw the water rising long before the first piece of steel was ever forged. Long before the White Star Line ever dreamed of building the Titanic, Morgan Robertson was a man intimately familiar with the unforgiving nature of the ocean. Born in 1861, he spent his youth as a cabin boy and a sailor, working on the rough waters of the Atlantic. He knew the creak of the wood, the cold bite of the wind, and the absolute isolation of the sea. But eventually, he left the sailing life behind to become a watchmaker, and later, a writer. Robertson was not a rich man. He lived in a small apartment, constantly struggling to pay his rent. He wrote seafaring stories to survive. And in the winter of 1897, sitting under the dim light of a gas lamp, he began drafting a story about a massive, unsinkable ocean liner. He decided to name his fictional ship, the Titan. In Robertson's mind, the Titan represented the absolute peak of human achievement. It was a monolithic structure of steel and luxury, designed to dominate the waves. In his book, titled Futility, he described the ship as the greatest piece of maritime engineering ever conceived by man. He wrote that the Titan was virtually unsinkable, a floating fortress that laughed in the face of nature. Now, let us pause for a moment and look at the year 1912. When the real Titanic sailed, the media called it unsinkable. The public believed it was a triumph of the modern world. The parallels between reality and Robertson's imagination do not just stop at a concept. They descend into a realm of mathematical precision that defies all logic. Let us break down the anatomy of these two ships. In his 1898 novel, Robertson wrote that his fictional ship, the Titan, was 800 limit words long. The real Titanic, built over a decade later, was 882 feet long. Robertson wrote that the Titan could reach a top speed of 25 knots. The real Titanic had a top speed of 24 to 25 knots. Robertson designed his fictional Titan to carry exactly 3,000 passengers and crew. The real Titanic had a total capacity of around 3,500 people, and on her maiden voyage, she carried over 2,200. But it gets much darker. The ultimate tragedy of the Titanic was the lack of lifeboats. The world remembers how hundreds of innocent people died simply because there was nowhere for them to sit. In the real world, the Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, which could only hold a fraction of the passengers. 14 years earlier, Morgan Robertson wrote that the Titan carried only 24 lifeboats, leaving more than half of its passengers completely doomed in the event of a disaster. The coincidences do not end with the structure of the ships. They extend to the exact time, the exact location, and the exact cause of destruction. In the novel Futility, the Titan leaves a port in New York, heading across the cold Atlantic during the month of April. In real life, the Titanic left Southampton, heading across the cold Atlantic, also in the month of April. On a foggy, freezing night in April, the fictional Titan is traveling at maximum speed when its lookouts spot a massive shape in the water. It is an iceberg. Before the crew can turn the massive ship, the ice tears open the starboard side of the vessel, filling the compartments with freezing water. The ship sinks rapidly, taking thousands of wealthy passengers down into the darkness. 14 years later, on April 14, 1912, at exactly 11:40 p.m., the real Titanic was traveling through a calm, freezing sea. The lookouts spotted a massive shape in the water. It was an iceberg. Before the crew could turn the massive ship, the ice tore open the starboard side of the vessel. The unsinkable Titanic sank in less than 3 hours. Both ships struck an iceberg on their starboard side. Both ships sank in the month of April. Both ships were roughly 400 miles from Newfoundland when they went down. When the news of the Titanic disaster hit the newspapers in April 1912, the world was paralyzed with grief. But for those who remembered the forgotten literature of the late 19th century, the grief was accompanied by absolute terror. People began searching for Morgan Robertson. Copies of his old book, Futility, which had been sitting in dusty corners of bookstores for 14 years, suddenly became the most valuable items in the world. The media rushed to Robertson's door. Journalists demanded to know how he had obtained this information. Had he seen the blueprints of the Titanic? Had he spoken to the engineers at Harland and Wolff? Had he received a vision from another world? Robertson's response was simple, yet deeply unsettling. He denied being a prophet. He denied having any supernatural powers. He told the press that he simply knew how ships were built, and he knew that maritime companies were building larger and faster vessels every year without increasing the number of lifeboats. He claimed it was just a matter of basic calculation and logical consequence. But those who knew Robertson intimately whispered a different story. Throughout his life, Robertson had claimed that he did not write his stories alone. He believed that he was possessed by an astral twin, a spiritual entity that took control of his pen and dictated the stories to him. He often told friends that he would sit down at his desk, fall into a trance-like state, and wake up hours later with pages of detailed technical writing that he did not remember composing. Was his mind tapping into a collective consciousness? Was he viewing a future timeline that had already been written in the fabric of the universe? To make this mystery even more profound, we must look at the fact that Morgan Robertson was not the only person who saw the tragedy before it happened. There was another man, a highly influential journalist and spiritualist named William Thomas Stead. In 1886, W.T. Stead wrote a short story for the Pall Mall Gazette. The story described a modern mail steamer that collided with another ship in the Atlantic. In his story, many passengers drowned because there were not enough lifeboats for everyone on board. At the end of the story, Stead added a direct warning to the public, writing, "This is exactly what will happen if ocean liners are sent to sea with too few lifeboats." 6 years later, in 1892, Stead published another piece of fiction called From the Old World to the New. In this story, a vessel named the Majestic helps rescue passengers from a ship that had just been destroyed after striking an iceberg in the North Atlantic. W.T. Stead had spent decades warning the world about the dangers of the Atlantic ice and the lack of safety equipment on modern ships. But his story takes a tragic, almost unbelievable turn. In April 1912, Stead was invited to travel to America. He booked a first-class ticket on a brand-new, magnificent ship that everyone said was completely safe. That ship was the Titanic. On the night of the disaster, as the water rose around the doomed vessel, eyewitnesses reported seeing W.T. Stead helping women and children into the few available lifeboats. He gave up his own chance of survival. The man who had written about the lack of lifeboats 26 years earlier was last seen sitting quietly in the first-class smoking room, reading a book as the ship began its final, fatal plunge into the deep. He became a victim of his own prophecy. How do we explain these occurrences? Skeptics argue that it is all a matter of probability. During the late 19th century, the race to build the largest and fastest transatlantic liners was at its peak. The danger of icebergs in the North Atlantic during the spring was a well-known fact among sailors. It is statistically possible that two different writers, working independently, could guess that a large ship named after the Titans of mythology would eventually strike ice and sink due to a lack of safety regulations. But even the most hardened skeptics find it difficult to ignore the sheer volume of precise details. The name, the speed, the weight, the number of lifeboats, the month, the location, the site of the impact. When all of these factors line up perfectly, the boundary between coincidence and prophecy begins to blur. Morgan Robertson did not find wealth or happiness after his prophecy came true. Although his book was republished under the title The Wreck of the Titan, he made very little money from it. The world looked at him not with admiration, but with a strange, superstitious fear. He became a shadow in the literary world, a man associated with one of the worst disasters in human history. On March 24, 1915, 3 years after the Titanic sank, Morgan Robertson was found dead in a hotel room in Atlantic City. He was standing up, leaning against a bureau, looking out the window toward the vast, dark ocean he had written about his entire life. The official cause of death was heart disease, but many believed he was simply consumed by the heavy weight of the visions he carried. The story of the Titan and the Titanic leaves us with a haunting question about the nature of time and human consciousness. Is the future fixed? Are there moments in history so monumental that their ripples travel backward through time, echoing in the minds of writers and artists years before they actually occur? We like to believe that we are the masters of our own destiny, that we build the future piece by piece with our own hands. But when we look back at the dusty pages of an 1898 novel, written by a lonely man in a dim room, we are reminded that sometimes, the tragic scripts of our reality have already been written long before we ever step onto the stage.